This is a sketchbook from a workshop that I taught in Montreal a few years ago. Montreal is a great place to go if you like to paint. It feels like you're in the middle of Europe, even though you're just across the border in Canada. This is a sketch that I did the first day that I was there before my students arrived. I always like to get there a couple days ahead of time so that I can really get to know the place and find all the good painting spots for us. This is a sketch that I did at the Plaza Royale, and I believe I did this as a demo, and I always love painting umbrellas, and white umbrellas are just a great way to learn about working with negative shapes and using everything that's around them to sort of create them with that negative space. It's also really good practice for painting a very, very busy scene that changes a lot. I didn't know this before I went there, but Montreal is right on the St. Lawrence River, and a lot of ships come in to dock there, and it's a great place for painting boats. I love to paint boats, so I was really, really enjoying this part of it. One of the highlights of our trip was a tour of the Notre Cathedral, and we actually had a private tour and we were allowed to sketch inside the cathedral. The only thing was we weren't allowed to use watercolor, so we had to do everything in pen and ink. And it was also really dark in there, so it was hard to see. So we all did our best, but it was a little bit of a challenge. And this was done from one of the planters that line the streets. They have beautiful flowers, all sorts of gardens all throughout the city, and so all of us just picked different spots to paint all of the flowers that were in the wonderful planters that line the streets. This is a little study on perspective. I had a student who was having some difficulty working with the architecture, so since it was a small group, I sat down with her and I just did this little demo of one-point perspective, just using pen and ink on the buildings and the trees lining one of the main nice boulevards. And then this was a painting of City Hall. This was a demo that I did on working with shadows and using shadows to create nice dramatic effects on the architecture and all the stonework. It really does feel like you're in Europe when you're in Montreal. Another highlight of our trip was a visit to the Botanical Gardens. I always like to pick places to visit that have either a botanical garden or some sort of parks that have a lot of beautiful flowers, because I love to paint flowers, and they're always a favorite thing for my students to paint. So this was, we were there in September, and so there were still a lot of really pretty things blooming, and this was in a little semi-private garden that we were able to paint right in the middle of the city. And then this was one of the restaurants that's right outside of the plaza by City Hall. Again, those red umbrellas were just screaming, paint me, paint me. So we all sat down in the middle of the square and painted the umbrellas, and then a few of us went over there and had some lunch. All of the shops in the city typically have very interesting window displays or awnings over them, and I just love the green and red stripes on these with the sunlight beating down on them. It was just a really, really pretty little scene, just like a little vignette. And then here's another one. I remember getting up early. A lot of times when I'm visiting a place with a group, I like to just get warmed up at the start of the day and just go out and sketch by myself for a bit. And so this was done on the main boulevard. There was a little shop that had some dresses and interesting items in the window, so I just grabbed a coffee, sat down on a bench, and did some practice. Now this is one of the demos that I did in the Chinese garden at the Botanical Gardens. They had all sorts of interesting structures. You can see there was water, interesting plants, and it was just a really, really fun place to go and explore. And it was a really, really big garden that covered acres and acres. And then last of all, this was a little sketch I did of some of the roses in the Japanese garden, again at the Montreal Botanical Gardens. And I love the pinks and the whites. I always love painting light-colored flowers with lots and lots of shadows on them. So that's about it, but it was a great trip, and I know Montreal is a city that I'll definitely be going back to in the future. and I hope maybe someday you can join me.